Storytelling is everything right and wrong in our world, and if I do my job today, you will know what I mean by the end of our workshop. Public speaking and being a college professor even is the opposite of what a writer likes. It's not a writer's ideal situation. And I blame my year of living fearlessly for getting me into trouble with these kinds of things. So during my first master's program, I studied the research behind fear, and I resolved that I was going to confront my biggest fears. I called it the year of living fearlessly. Remember the old Staples commercial, the I can do that with the help of the easy button? I internalized that message, so whenever I was faced with a fearful opportunity, I said, yes, I can do that. But public speaking and being a teacher, that was sort of always the last bastion until I did some research and listened to other writers telling their stories. They were fascinating people, fascinating stories, and I thought, yes, I can do that. One author in particular had an intriguing story filled with all manner of happy accidents that included George Lucas, Star Wars, and the band Rush. It was as if Kevin J. Anderson had found the writer's easy button, and I thought, wow, telling your story sounds pretty cool. But after I said yes to public speaking and being a teacher of writing, it finally hit me. My writing story doesn't have an easy button. What my story does have is purple paper. A purple pen, which in hindsight gives an all-new meaning to the phrase purple prose. I was in the 5th grade, living on the south end of town at Chamberlain Elementary School. I don't mean to brag, but for 5th grade recess, I ruled the school. I was the queen of the playground. I was fearless. So when Mr. Pittman assigned a creative writing prompt, I accepted the challenge. I no longer have a copy of my opus, but I am assured by memory that it was amazing. The prompt centered on the Bermuda Triangle, our 5th grade class, and a first line that sent chills through the hearts and minds of younger elementary kids. In short, if anyone could do justice to the highly plausible story, it was me, the queen of the playground. The day we read our story to class, I wore a dress. Now, if you know anything about playgrounds, you know that dresses are completely inappropriate. How can you climb the monkey bars, straddle the slide, and wage war against the boys in a dress? That day, the boys were brutal, but I persevered until I could be the first to read my story to the class. Proudly, I carried that sheath of purple pages to the front beside Mr. Pittman's desk. I read a tale of mayhem. As every 5th grader knew, the Bermuda Triangle was nothing to trifle with, but we did. As a class, in my story at least, we took a cruise to the Triangle, and as story would dictate, all hell broke loose, but never fear, I was there to save the day. When I walked head held high back to my seat, purple pages in hand, Mr. Pittman said, "Wow, now I see why you wore a dress." It took me a couple decades to realize he never actually said it was a good story, but that didn't matter. I loved telling my story. I knew that someday I would be a writer. That was the year we moved again. Shortly after having written the story, we moved to a school where I was more of a serf than a queen. I missed the loyal subjects of my former 5th grade playground. My father had had a major car accident in a spring snowstorm between Denver and Castle Rock, and my mother, a stay-at-home mom, became the breadwinner, and Mom went back to college while working and taking care of 4 kids. We moved every time our lease was up. We moved 10 times before I graduated, and in that time, I attended 4 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 1 high school. These moves meant that I was perpetually the new kid. In the 7th grade, now at Horseman Middle School, I was convinced of my writing future. So when my English teacher announced a writing contest, I entered. The story wasn't quite as amazing as the Bermuda Triangle story, but it was a noir detective story complete with hard-boiled and alcoholic detective with weird clues that I called Blue Horizon. This time, I didn't have Mr. Pittman's praise, but I knew it was a good story. I typed it up myself with a carbon copy I still have in a file somewhere and turned it into the teacher, who passed it on to the head of the English department for scoring. When the teacher finally handed it back, I knew I hadn't won, but I wanted to see my score. After class, I peeked open the folder and found a note I really don't think anyone intended for me to see. In my teacher's old-fashioned script, it said, "This sounds borrowed." As a world-wise 13-year-old, I thought she meant that I had literally stolen someone else's story. And if that was true, then dang, I was good. But what I've grown to understand is that she thought my story was unoriginal, borrowed in the sense that it was like so many other bad detective stories. At any rate, the result was the same. I was offended and hurt. But I still planned to be a writer. That was the year my father died. I spent a year mourning him and writing a Civil War novel because nothing says grief quite like the Civil War. We moved several times in the ensuing years, but I'd had enough of this new kid nonsense. I told my mom I was done changing schools, and though we moved often, I stayed at Palmer, where I was less and less that fearless girl who wrote stories on purple paper. Instead, I wrote snippets of stories in my spiral notebooks when I should have been listening to the teachers. One, my least favorite English teacher, and there were several of those, yes, I see the irony, called me out for it. She thought I was writing notes to another student, which was ridiculous. I wouldn't waste my time on something so frivolous. I was writing. She demanded I proved it. I refused. It wasn't that I was fearless. I was mostly quiet and shy, but I damn sure wasn't letting her see my work. What if she said, as my 7th grade teacher had, that it sounded borrowed? I crumpled the piece of paper and tossed it in the garbage on the way out of class. Later that year, when she announced a writing contest, I went up to get the paperwork. She said, "You?" in that tone. You know the one. And I didn't bother turning in the story. I didn't need another teacher writing another humiliating note. In college, I continued to work on that epic Civil War novel. My roommate's father, after hearing about my novel, asked, "How many books have that title, do you think?" I don't remember the name of the book, but I remember the lesson. You're unoriginal, they all seem to say. But I still plan to be a writer. Those of you who are grammarians might notice that writing was always in the future tense. I will be, not I am. Somewhere between the queen of the playground years and college, in all the moves and all the unfortunate English teachers, I lost my sense of fearlessness. I quit college and joined the Air Force to see the world. They sent me to Oklahoma. After the initial shock and some technical training, I did get to see the world, traveling 265 days a year to exotic places like the inside of an alert facility in the California desert. Oh, the inside of an airplane, 35,000 feet over Europe. And once, 30 minutes overseas in an airport where we stopped long enough for the crew to get off and buy cases of German beer. I left the Air Force and worked as a travel agent right before the internet made them obsolete, and went back to college before getting pregnant and spending 10 years as a stay-at-home mom of 2. With the military, we moved nearly as often as my mother had until the queen of the playground with her purple paper and purple prose wasn't even pretending to write. But I still plan to be a writer. Someday. That was the year of my divorce, which for the sake of brevity we'll just call ugly. I moved back to Colorado to heal, and part of the healing process was spending at least an hour a day on the treadmill, partly because the gym offered childcare, and as a single mom, that hour was the only time I had to myself. Amidst the struggles of a new single mom with a serious lack of money and time, working multiple jobs, and treading shark-infested waters, I decided to stop planning and be. That was the year I started writing. I unpacked my new single life, and lying between the crumpled packing paper and the chipped dishware, I found the girl who wrote stories on purple paper. I plotted during that hour of solitude on the treadmill. It started with a question. What kind of character spends this much time on a treadmill? Her name was Sophia, and she lived in a fictional town of Aspen Springs in Colorado. In hindsight, I wish I had kept Colorado Springs in the story, but I had made a few alterations to the landscape and made a few derogatory remarks about the police, so I decided it was safer to stick with Aspen Springs. Sophia, the character, didn't seem to fit anywhere. She didn't have any friends, but she did have a bodyguard. What was her story? What was she running from? Who was she running from? And what was the worst that could happen between dropping a kid off and picking him up in the gym daycare? While I wrote the book, I started the creative writing program at Regis and drove to Denver on weekends. And I worked and I parented and I really didn't sleep much. When I finished the book, Untouchable, I started sending it out. But remember, I don't have an easy button. I started a nice collection of rejection letters like some people collect pennies in a jar until I had the Holy of Holies, a revise and resubmit letter, which was a laundry list of changes they wanted me to make and send back, which I did. Then I waited and took classes and wrote personal essays and worked a couple jobs with the editor. I don't know. What were they doing? Finally, she emailed me. She liked the changes and was sending the book to acquisitions, which was where I would finally have a contract. I waited 6 weeks after that first email, 8 weeks. I finally gathered my courage and emailed the editor. She replied she was leaving the company and the contract would have to wait until the publisher replaced her. It's called being an orphan because you have no one advocating for you with the publisher. As you can imagine, the process took time, determination, and persistence on my part. It wasn't easy. In May of 2015, I graduated with my first master's degree. That was the year Untouchable hit the bookshelves. I was finally a writer. And I was also knee-deep in a summer residency program for my next master's. Even though I was busy with the program, I was also writing. That October, and literally 1 month, I wrote Unforgettable, a story connected to the first book, but this one set in Manitou Springs, and I didn't change the name. Earlier that year, I'd climbed the incline and made several trips up Bar Trail, so the area was familiar and seemed like the perfect place for my offbeat bohemian character with an unusual job. She was a hypnotherapist, and I thought she would fit in Manitou nicely. I even visited a hypnotherapist to get the details right. I wanted to know if it was possible to forget unpleasant memories using hypnosis, hence the title Unforgettable. Then I started asking questions again. What would this character want to forget and why? And what danger would her forgetfulness put her in? The opening scene starts with a woman going downhill toward Ruxton Road as she runs from a hitman. It was fun, it was a fast story to write, and when I finished, I wrote Unstoppable, the final book in the trilogy, this one set in the Colorado mountains. Earlier that summer, I'd taken my kids up to Grand Lake, and notice how real life kind of informs my fiction. On the way back, I took Trail Ridge Road to Estes Park. I don't know if you've ever driven Trail Ridge Road. I hadn't yet, and it was terrifying. I have a fear of heights, which definitely made this situation worse. While I was driving, slowly I might add, from point A to point B, I had a major panic attack. Laughing at me, my daughter threatened to take a video from the passenger seat so we could be YouTube famous. And naturally, I declined. But later, I forced my characters to drive through the same mountain pass. What would make these characters risk Trail Ridge Road as a snowstorm barreled in? What were they running from? What would happen if they got trapped in that town when the road closed? Which it does during the winter months. I sent the book off to my editor, and as you may have guessed, remember, no easy button, I waited. It was December, and I was in a Christmas mood, so I went back to my original book, Untouchable, and wrote a short novella about the couple's first Christmas together. I waited nearly 7 months with no news before I started to raise a stink. And that's when I found out, and this is really where you have to pay attention. My contract said they had 30 days to get back to me, or I could have taken my books elsewhere. But because I was new and didn't bother looking at my contract, I didn't realize it. The result was they got rid of that particular editor, and I got a contract for those 2 books I'd already written and the novella combined with a new editor who wouldn't keep me waiting for months at a time. The editor, the new one, was from Colorado Springs, so I was able to meet with her face-to-face, when we could still meet face-to-face. She knew the neighborhoods I was writing about. We found a good rhythm working together. In fact, she's one of the reasons those books have a much better pace and feel than the first book. We had the same style, and she let me keep my voice, so it came across much more authentic. The entire series was set in Colorado, and the books helped the girl with her purple pages to move from, I'm going to be a writer someday, to I am a writer. But as the editing finished up, long before their publication, a whole nother story about how long it takes to get published. My editor took a new job as a managing editor of a small-town newspaper in Montana. She's still there. And I was once again orphaned. I didn't want to continue my Untouchable series with a new editor, despite having written the opening of the next book. I wasn't even sure I wanted to stay with my publisher without a strong editorial relationship. So that was the year I started my second series, Team Fear. In the first series, I wrote Where I Know Best, Colorado. In the second series, I wrote Who I Know Best, and that was the military. The series started in the same way as the first, me on the treadmill plodding away. It started with questions. What is fear? While I was at Regis, fear became a major research topic for me, and the more I studied, the more fear fascinated me. How can we overcome it? And if we do, what takes fear's place? It wasn't until I read an article about the ways in which scientists work to mask the symptoms of fear that I found what I needed to start the series. The article discussed a real experiment used during the Iraq War to eliminate fear in pilots. The advantages to warfighting were tremendous, but there were side effects, and ultimately the government stopped the experiment when bad things happened. Bad things happening is like a drug to a writer. What kind of bad things could I create, fictionally of course, for these men? I started with the idea of an experiment to eliminate the physiological response to fear, but this time on soldiers rather than pilots. What were the personal costs to the men who took part in the experiment? Again, starting with questions. What were the bad things that canceled the program? And what were the side effects of such an experiment? The book starts with a Special Forces soldier walking between a police barricade on one side and a soldier barricaded in a house on the other. Sergeant Ryder was and is truly without fear, but something other had taken fear's place in his psyche. This series released between the last two books in my Untouchable series, again, because the lead time on publication is so long. And at the end, I was working simultaneously on my master's thesis, my critical thesis, and the Team Fear series. Oh, and I had a job. Sleep was a distant memory. My creative thesis is the book that I'm rewriting now, and it blends two pieces of me represented by the other series. It's set in Colorado, but it also focuses on the military. This book is women's fiction with a female protagonist. The initial draft came to me over the course of a few weeks while my kids were visiting their dad. It came so fast that I wasn't taking time for regular showers or regular meals, regular sleep. And when I did sleep, the computer slept in the bed beside me. The idea started with the scene here in Colorado on the Eastern Plains near where my sister lives. Even now, I see the opening like a movie. A former soldier, hair in a bun, duffel bag in hand, returns to her Colorado home after 10 years in the Army. She's standing on the hard-packed dirt outside a dilapidated old farmhouse, afraid to enter, but with nowhere else to go. The question started again. Who or what was in that house? Why had she joined the Army 10 years ago? And why was she coming home now? Blending the end of one series and the start of another while working on a master's thesis was chaotic, and as you can imagine, it wasn't easy. In fact, I still haven't found the easy button for writing. No George Lucas, no Star Wars, no famous band to grease the way. I haven't even found a shortcut button. But I think I know why. The easy button isn't what we need. Or maybe it's not what I need. Researcher and writer Lisa Crone, in her book Wired for Story, and we're going to talk more about this, discusses the ways in which the human brain is designed around storytelling. Anthropologically, story protects us from danger. Imagine living with early man, and an elder comes back from a near-death experience. As he tells his story, he's showing the clan where the danger lies and how to avoid or overcome that danger. Contemporary writers do the same thing, only the dangerous predator wears many masks, and writers show us how to survive them. How do the characters handle the danger? That's the point of the story. Do they run? Do they fight? Do they hide? As humans, we read for entertainment, sure, but we read to work through our own struggles. Story teaches us how to deal with emotional or dangerous or tumultuous times. Story teaches us to be empathetic. When I told my mother years ago that I wanted to be a writer, she cried, maybe more than she cried when I joined the military. She cried, she said, because writers lived hard lives, and she didn't want that for me. A concept I actually understand better now that I'm a parent. Her premise wasn't wrong, but the hard times, as she called them, had a purpose. They made me more aware of myself, of fellow humans, of struggles outside my own experience. They taught me to be an observer. In short, they taught me to be a writer. Through my ugly experiences, I learned a part of the larger human experience, human struggle, and the delicate balance or imbalance in the human psyche. I learned to write basic human conflict. Now I put characters into stressful situations so readers don't have to live through those struggles in real life. They can read them in the book. So while I might want an easy button in my life, easy would not make a good literary life. While I was working on this class, I went online to get an audio file of the easy button. I tried 3 files, and if you've been paying attention, you will rightfully predict that not one of those files worked, no matter what adjustments I made or what computer I used, because the easy button doesn't work for me. For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to be a writer, but first I had to experience life, travel, work, marriage, children, struggles, adversity. In fact, it wasn't until I reached my lowest point, struggling the most, that I finally wrote a novel worth publishing, because I needed to experience adversity to understand my characters and their complicated plots. In August of 2017, I graduated with an MFA in creative writing. I had been divorced for 9 years. In that time, I had earned 3 degrees and started a new life as a college professor. In the 2 years it took to complete my final degree and my thesis, I wrote and published 6 books, a novella, and multiple creative nonfiction essays. I had up to 4 jobs at one time while going to school and parenting my children. It was never easy. But easy wouldn't have given me so many stories to tell. Now, if you've been paying attention while you were listening to my story, you were learning about storytelling. If you think back to the anthropological scenario, imagine living with early man and an elder comes back from a near-death experience. As he tells his story, he's showing the clan where the danger lies and how to avoid or overcome it. In this instance, I am the, let's not say elder, let's just say experienced member of the tribe who has been to the dangerous side of writing. Writers listen and learn from my story in the same way readers learn from your stories. Storytelling isn't about what writers want to say, although it can be, but it's really about what writers offer the tribe. The rest of today, we're going to work on building your storytelling skills.